The grand conclave of stellar nations sparkled like a living constellation, its crystalline dome reflecting the light of 3 moons. James Harrison adjusted his formal diplomatic attire, trying to appear confident despite being thoroughly overwhelmed. As Earth's youngest ambassador at 32, he carried the weight of humanity's first major interstellar conference on his shoulders. "Remember, Harrison, observe all formal protocols," Ambassador Chen's words echoed in his mind. "The Austrians are particularly sensitive about diplomatic etiquette." The Austrian delegation entered the chamber, and all ambient conversation ceased. Queen Vizara moved with fluid grace, her silver-white hair floating as if underwater, complementing skin that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns. Unlike the stern demeanor James had expected from the leader of the most powerful spacefaring civilization, her eyes held a curious warmth. The welcoming ceremony required representatives from each world to perform their traditional greetings. James had studied the Earth protocol thoroughly, a formal bow with right hand over heart. However, as Queen Vizara approached, the practiced movement fled his mind. She stood before him, tall and regal, her crystalline crown catching starlight. James felt the eyes of hundreds of delegates upon him. In his nervous state, he combined what he remembered of the Earth gesture with what he'd seen other species do. He extended his left hand, palm up, while touching his right hand to his forehead and making a half bow. The chamber erupted in gasps. Queen Vizara's eyes widened, the patterns on her skin pulsing with bright blues and purples. Her personal guard shifted, hands moving to ceremonial weapons. "The Earth delegate honors us deeply," Vizara announced, her voice musical and clear. "I accept this most traditional of proposals." James froze. "P proposal?" The Queen's chief advisor stepped forward, beaming. "The sacred hand of union, combined with the mind's promise, a courtship ritual not used in over 5 centuries. How thoroughly you have studied our ancient ways, Ambassador Harrison." As understanding dawned, James felt the blood drain from his face. Through a simple mix-up of gestures, he had apparently proposed marriage to the most powerful monarch in known space. He began, but the thunderous applause drowned out any chance of immediate correction. Queen Vizara's expression remained serene, but James caught a glimmer of something. Was it amusement? In her iridescent eyes. As the ceremony continued around them, she leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "Interesting opening move, Ambassador. I look forward to learning whether this was brilliant strategy or delightful accident." The following hours passed in a blur. James endured countless congratulations from delegates who saw this as a masterful diplomatic maneuver. His own team alternated between panic and grudging admiration for accidentally securing the closest alliance possible with the Austrian Empire. That evening, in his private quarters, James paced. A soft chime announced a visitor, Queen Vizara herself, accompanied by a single guard who remained outside. "Your Majesty," James began, "about the ceremony dash." "Please," she raised a graceful hand, "call me Vizara when we're private. After all, we are engaged." Her tone carried that same hint of amusement he'd noticed earlier. "That's just it," James said. "It was a mistake. I mixed up the gestures. I would never presume to dash. To court the Queen of the Austrian Empire." Vizara finished, moving to the window. The starlight caught her profile, and James found himself momentarily speechless. "Tell me, James Harrison, do you know why I accepted?" He shook his head. "Because in 900 years of diplomatic relations, you're the first to make me laugh." She turned to face him fully. "My advisors spend years calculating every possibility, every alliance, every strategic marriage proposal. Then you walk in and, through pure accident, create the most interesting diplomatic incident of the century." James found himself smiling despite the absurdity of the situation. "So, what happens now?" "Now," Vizara said, her skin shimming with patterns that seemed almost playful, "we have a choice. We can announce a mutual decision to respectfully withdraw from the engagement, very proper, very diplomatic. Or Or we see where this goes. Sometimes the best discoveries come from unexpected mistakes. She moved toward the door, then paused. Think about it, James Harrison. Either way, you've certainly made this summit far more entertaining than anyone anticipated. As the door closed behind her, James sat heavily in his chair. He had come to the conclave hoping to make history in diplomatic relations. He'd certainly achieved that, just not quite in the way he'd planned. The morning after James' accidental proposal brought new challenges. He entered the grand conference chamber to find his assigned seat had been moved, directly beside Queen Vizara's ornate throne. The whispers and stares from other delegates followed his every move. "I trust you slept well, my betrothed?" Vizara's voice carried a hint of playfulness as he took his seat. Her skin rippled with gentle waves of turquoise, a color he was beginning to associate with her amusement. As well as one can after accidentally proposing to interstellar royalty, James whispered back, earning a melodic chuckle from the Queen. The day's agenda focused on trade agreements, but James found it difficult to concentrate. Every time he glanced at Vizara, she was already watching him, studying his reactions with those fascinating iridescent eyes. During a brief recess, she pulled him into a private alcove. "Your mind seems elsewhere, James Harrison," she observed, her head tilted slightly. "Are you perhaps regretting our arrangement?" "I'm still trying to understand it," he admitted. "Why maintain this pretense?" Vizara's expression grew thoughtful. "Tell me, what do you know of Austrian politics?" "Only what's in our briefings. Your empire spans 12 star systems, you've ruled for over 2 centuries, and..." He paused, remembering a crucial detail, "There's been increasing pressure from your council of elders for you to choose a consort." "Precisely." Her skin darkened to deep blue. "For decades, they've paraded potential matches before me, calculating nobles, ambitious military commanders, all seeking power rather than partnership." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Then you arrive, with no agenda beyond your own diplomatic mission, and make the most endearingly honest mistake I've witnessed in centuries." James felt his face warm. "So I'm what? A convenient escape from political pressure?" "You're an opportunity," Vizara corrected. "For both of us. Think about it, Earth seeks stronger ties with the Austrian Empire. My people need to see their queen considering a real connection, not just political maneuvering. And you?" She smiled, "You get to turn an embarrassing diplomatic incident into a potential triumph." Before James could respond, a commotion erupted in the main chamber. They hurried back to find a delegation from the Nexus Confederation, the Austrian Empire's primary rivals, demanding the floor. This supposed engagement is nothing but Earth's attempt to manipulate the balance of power. The Nexus ambassador's translator crackled with indignation. "We demand an investigation into Ambassador Harrison's security clearance and possible hidden agendas." James felt his heart rate spike, but Vizara's response was swift and commanding. Her skin blazed with patterns he hadn't seen before, sharp, assertive designs in brilliant silver. "The Nexus Confederation forgets its place," she declared, rising to her full height. "My personal matters are not subject to their approval or investigation. Unless, of course, they wish to formally challenge the sovereignty of the Austrian throne." The Nexus ambassador backed down immediately, but the damage was done. The political implications of their engagement could no longer be ignored. During the evening reception, James found himself cornered by his own superior, Director Walsh. "Harrison, what exactly is your game here?" Walsh demanded in hushed tones. "Sir, Because either you've made the diplomatic blunder of the century, or you've somehow stumbled into the most brilliant political maneuver I've ever seen. The Austrians are already hinting at expanded trade rights, and 3 other systems have approached us about alliance talks." James glanced across the room, where Vizara was holding court among various dignitaries. She caught his eye and gave him a subtle wink, a very human gesture she must have learned recently. "To be honest, sir," James said, "I'm still figuring that out myself." Later that night, Bizarra invited him to her private gardens, a stunning zero-gravity arboretum where luminescent flowers floated like stars. They walked among the drifting blooms, their conversation turning from politics to more personal matters. "Tell me about Earth," she requested. "Not the diplomatic briefings. Tell me what you love about your world." James found himself describing sunrise over the Pacific, the smell of rain on hot pavement, the way cities looked from airplane windows at night. Bizarra listened with genuine fascination, her skin shifting through subtle shades of rose and gold. "You speak of your world with such passion," she observed. "It reminds me of how I feel about the ancient crystal forests of Austria." "Perhaps." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps we should visit both, you and I. If we're to maintain this engagement, we should at least know each other's homes." James caught a floating flower, its petals glowing softly in his palm. "Is that what you want? To maintain this?" Bizarra moved closer, her luminescence casting gentle light between them. "I want to explore possibilities, James Harrison. Our peoples have danced around real connection for centuries, always maintaining careful distance. Maybe it takes an honest mistake to bridge that gap." She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the flower from his hand. The touch sent a subtle electric tingle through his skin, a biological trait of her species he hadn't known about. "Besides," she added with that now familiar hint of mischief in her eyes, "you still owe me a proper proposal to replace the accidental one." As they continued their walk through the floating garden, James realized that what had started as a diplomatic disaster was evolving into something far more intriguing, and potentially far more meaningful, than he could have imagined. As the stellar conclave entered its second week, James found himself immersed in an intensive crash course on Austrian culture. His mornings began with lessons from Bizarra's chief cultural advisor, Master Thaler, a scholarly figure whose phosphorescent markings pulsed with excitement whenever James grasped a new concept. "The skin luminescence patterns are not merely decorative," Thaler explained one morning, displaying holographic examples. "They form a subtle language all their own. Our queen's patterns when she's with you are most intriguing." "What do you mean?" James asked, suddenly more alert. Thaler's own patterns flickered with what James had learned to recognize as diplomatic evasion. "That, perhaps, is a discussion best had with Her Majesty directly." That opportunity came sooner than expected. During an afternoon recess, Bizarra invited James to her private study, a chamber whose walls seemed alive with flowing data streams and stellar maps. She was reviewing trade proposals when he arrived, her skin displaying the focused patterns of deep concentration. "James," she smiled, her patterns shifting to those warmer tones he'd grown fond of. "I trust Master Thaler's lessons are proving enlightening." "Very. Though he seems reluctant to explain certain aspects of Austrian bioluminescence." James watched with fascination as Bizarra's patterns momentarily flickered with what he now recognized as embarrassment. "Ah," she said, moving to adjust a floating star chart. "Some patterns are personal. Intimate, even. They reveal emotions we might prefer to keep private." James stepped closer, studying the dancing lights beneath her skin. "Like the way your patterns form symmetric spirals and you're trying not to laugh at diplomatic posturing? Or how they pulse like starlight when you're excited about a new idea?" Bizarra turned to him, surprise evident in both her expression and her luminescence. "You've been paying attention. I'm a diplomat. It's my job to notice details." He paused, gathering courage. "And I've had excellent motivation to study these particular details carefully." The patterns across Bizarra's skin shifted to a new configuration, one he hadn't seen before. Soft, wave-like movements in shades of rose and gold that seemed to reach toward him. "James," she said softly, "you should know that these patterns, they cannot lie. Unlike words or gestures, they are involuntary expressions of our true feelings." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Before either could speak further, an urgent chime interrupted. A holographic message materialized, news that would complicate their situation dramatically. Earth's Security Council is demanding your immediate return, Bizarra read, her patterns darkening with concern. They claim you've exceeded your diplomatic authority and potentially compromised Earth's independent standing. James felt his stomach sink. They're afraid of how this looks, their junior ambassador suddenly engaged to the most powerful monarch in known space. They think I'm either being manipulated or I'm acting without proper clearance. Are you? Bizarra asked, her patterns now completely still, a sign of intense focus. Being manipulated? No. Acting without clearance? He laughed softly. Absolutely. But I'm starting to think that might not be a bad thing. Bizarra moved to the window, gazing out at the spectacular nebula that served as backdrop to the conclave station. There are those in my court who share similar concerns. The Council of Elders convenes tomorrow to discuss the appropriateness of our engagement. What will you tell them? She turned back to him, her patterns now showing the sharp, decisive configurations he'd seen her use in diplomatic negotiations. I will tell them that for centuries, we've approached interspecies relations through careful distance and calculated moves. Perhaps it's time for a different approach. And what approach is that? Honesty, she said simply. Complete, unguarded honesty. Like these patterns we cannot hide. She stepped closer, close enough that the light from her bioluminescence cast soft shadows on his face. I will tell them that what began as an accident has become something genuine. That I've found someone who sees me as more than a political prize or a throne to be won. James felt his breath catch. Bizarra. Your Earth Council fears you're being manipulated by alien influences. My elders fear I'm being swayed by human impetuousness. Neither understands that sometimes the most powerful diplomatic moves are the ones that come from the heart. Her patterns were now showing that same wave-like, reaching configuration he'd seen earlier. Acting on instinct, James reached out and touched her hand. The electric tingle of her skin met his fingers, and her patterns erupted in brilliant swirls of light. I may have proposed by accident, he said softly, but I'm starting to think it might have been the wisest mistake I've ever made. Bizarra's free hand came up to touch his face, her bioluminescence pulsing in sync with her words. Then perhaps it's time we turn this diplomatic incident into something real. Something that could bridge not just our hearts, but our worlds. As they stood there, surrounded by flowing data streams and distant stars, James realized that their accidental engagement had evolved into something neither of their governments had anticipated, a genuine connection that transcended political maneuvering and cultural barriers. The challenges ahead were daunting, but as Bizarra's patterns danced with emotions she couldn't hide, James knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as a diplomatic arrangement, but as partners in something far more meaningful. The combined session of Earth's Security Council and the Astrian Council of Elders was an unprecedented event. James stood before the gathered dignitaries in the grand amphitheater, feeling the weight of two civilizations' scrutiny. Bizarra sat among her elders, her patterns carefully neutral, though James caught occasional flickers of concern when their eyes met. Ambassador Harrison, Earth's chief counselor Bennett began, her voice sharp. You realize your actions could be interpreted as emotional compromise of a diplomatic position? An engagement to an alien monarch was certainly not part of your mission parameters. Before James could respond, Elder Corix of the Astrian Council rose, his ancient patterns rippling with skepticism. And we question whether a human could truly understand the profound responsibilities of consort to an Astrian queen. Our traditions span millennia. James took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. With respect to both councils, I believe you're asking the wrong questions. The real question is, why are we so afraid of genuine connection between our peoples? A murmur rippled through the chamber. Bizarra's patterns flickered with interest, encouraging him to continue. For centuries, we've hidden behind diplomatic protocols and careful distance. We trade resources, share some technology, but never truly understand each other. Look at this very chamber, humans on one side, Astrians on the other. Even now, we maintain our separation. He moved to the center of the floor, turning to address both sides. What started as an accidental proposal has become something more meaningful. Not just between Queen Vizara and myself, but as a symbol of what's possible when we stop calculating every interaction and allow genuine understanding to develop. Elder Corix's patterns flashed with indignation. Pretty words, but they do not address the practical concerns. The Astrian throne requires dash. The Astrian throne requires someone who sees beyond their own world's interests, Vizara interrupted, rising from her seat. Her patterns blazed with determination as she moved to stand beside James. For too long, we've treated interspecies relations like a complex game of strategy. Ambassador Harrison's accident showed us another way. She turned to face her elders directly. You worry he doesn't understand our traditions? He's learned more about our emotional patterns in 2 weeks than most diplomatic envoys learn in years. You fear he'll prioritize Earth's interests. He's already demonstrated more concern for genuine understanding than political advantage. Counselor Bennett leaned forward. And what of Earth's standing? This union would effectively make humanity junior partners to the Astrian Empire. Or, James countered, it would make us family. Not superior or junior, but connected in a way that transcends political hierarchies. Imagine what our peoples could achieve if we stopped focusing on power dynamics and started building real bridges. Vizara's patterns shifted to display something new, a complex, harmonious configuration that drew gasps from the Astrian elders. She took James's hand, the touch sending that familiar electric tingle through his skin. My patterns cannot lie, she announced. Look at them and see the truth. What began as an accident has become a genuine bond. More than that, it has shown us a new path forward. Will we have the courage to take it? The chamber erupted in discussion. Hours of debate followed, with both councils raising concerns and demanding assurances. Through it all, James and Vizara stood united, their joined hands a physical symbol of the bridge they hoped to build. As the session finally drew to a close, both councils withdrew to deliberate. James and Vizara retreated to their now familiar sanctuary in the floating gardens. No matter what they decide, Vizara said softly, her patterns showing the private configuration he'd come to recognize as deepest affection, you've already changed how our peoples see each other. That alone is a diplomatic triumph. James touched the luminescent markings on her arm, watching them respond to his touch. I've stopped thinking of this as diplomacy, he admitted. Somewhere between the cultural lessons and late-night conversations about our worlds, this became something much more personal. Vizara's patterns shifted to mirror his touch, creating a synchronized dance of light between them. The elders would say that's precisely why they should forbid this union. Too personal, too emotional, too unprecedented. And what do you say? She turned to face him fully, her patterns now displaying that same beautiful harmony she'd shown in the council chamber. I say that in 9 centuries of life, I've never felt more certain of anything. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The garden's floating flowers drifted around them like stars, and in that moment, surrounded by living light, James realized that his greatest diplomatic achievement had come not from careful planning or political strategy, but from a simple willingness to let his heart guide him across the cosmic divide. After 3 days of intense deliberation, both councils reached their decision. The Grand Chamber was packed with delegates from across known space, all eager to witness the outcome of this unprecedented situation. James stood beside Vizara, their hands clasped discreetly as Elder Corix rose to speak. Never in our history has the Council of Elders faced such a unique challenge, he began, his patterns showing formal dignity. A human and an Astrian queen, brought together by what some called accident, others destiny. Counselor Bennett stood next. Both our peoples have expressed valid concerns about this union. The implications for interstellar politics are complex, the cultural challenge is significant. James felt Vizara's hand tighten slightly in his. Her patterns remained diplomatically neutral, but he could feel the tension in her touch. However, Elder Korix continued, his patterns shifting to show something rarely seen, acceptance of change. We have witnessed something extraordinary. Not just in the connection between Queen Vizara and Ambassador Harrison, but in how their union has already begun transforming relations between our peoples. Counselor Bennett nodded. In the past 3 weeks, we've seen more genuine cultural exchange and understanding than in decades of formal diplomacy. Sometimes the best path forward is the unexpected one. Therefore, they announced together, both councils hereby give their blessing to this union, with certain diplomatic provisions. The chamber erupted in applause. Vizara's patterns exploded in joyous light, a display so brilliant it momentarily dimmed the chamber's illumination. Without caring about protocol, she pulled James into an embrace that sent electric tingles through his entire body. The celebrations that followed were like nothing either civilization had seen before. The wedding ceremony combined Earth and Astrian traditions, creating something entirely new. James wore a suit embedded with bioluminescent crystals that responded to his emotions, while Vizara's gown incorporated traditional human symbols alongside Astrian patterns. Their vows were spoken in both languages, with Vizara's patterns telling their own story of love and commitment. When they kissed, the combined light from her joy patterns and his crystalline suit created a spectacular aurora that had the guests gasping in wonder. But beyond the ceremony itself, something more profound was happening. Humans and Astrians mingled freely, sharing stories and customs. Cultural barriers began dissolving as genuine friendships formed. What had started as a diplomatic incident was becoming a catalyst for real change. 1 year later, James and Vizara stood in Earth's first Astrian garden, watching human children play among floating luminescent flowers while their parents learned about alien botany from Astrian scientists. "Remember when you said I owed you a proper proposal?" James asked, his crystal-enhanced suit shimming with affection. Vizara's patterns danced playfully. "The accidental one worked out quite well, I'd say." "Still," he said, taking her hand. "I've learned enough about Astrian traditions now to do this right." His suit crystals synchronized with her patterns as he performed the ancient courtship gesture perfectly this time, adding his own touch that made her patterns pulse with delight. "My love," she laughed, "the sound like music, we're already married." "Then consider it a renewal of vows," he smiled. "A promise to keep building bridges, not just between us, but between all our peoples." Their union had opened doors no one had anticipated. Joint scientific missions, cultural exchange programs, and deep space exploration teams now featured humans and Astrians working side by side. Their love story had become legend, taught in diplomatic academies as an example of how the heart's wisdom sometimes exceeded careful political calculation. As they stood together, watching their two civilizations slowly become one family, their patterns and crystals danced in perfect harmony, a living symbol of the bridges that could be built when love dared to cross the stars. The end.